Fresh Economic Thinking podcast, new ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir.
Welcome back to the Fresh Economic Thinking podcast. Cameron Murray is my name. Today I'm speaking with Pete Wargent, property buyer and analyst. Pete and I have followed each other's property analysis and writing for many years, and I've really wanted to have him on the show to just shoot the breeze and find out from someone who's dealing with buying and selling property on the ground every day, find out his views on some of the more complex issues in Australian property. So Pete, thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure. Thanks, Cam. As you said, been following your work for so many years now, and it's always good to chat.
Terrific. So maybe you should introduce yourself to the listeners. I can hear an accent there. Did you adopt the Aussie property culture on arrival, or did you bring it with you? And how does one get into becoming a buyer's agent and analyst? What's your story, Pete?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a chartered accountant by profession. I came to Australia back in the 1990s. Like most new arrivals, I went to Sydney first because that was the only place I knew, and everyone I knew was from Sydney. It'd be an interesting case study actually, because I've kind of people talk about sort of investment bubbles and things like that. Well, I'd be a very good case study for that, because like a lot of people, I went to work in the mining sector during the resources construction boom, and then later on segued into a career in real estate. So I guess you could say in some ways I have followed the big Aussie trends in that regard. I guess I'd always had an interest in economics, and particularly housing market economics. But quite a well-trodden path these days. When I started out, there were very few buyers agents in Australia, maybe half a dozen in Sydney, but these days they're everywhere. So I guess, I've been sort of leading and following some of those trends that are so common in the media.
So tell me more about a buyer's agent, because this is not a common thing in Australia. But from my understanding, in the United States, it is common for buyers of property to get their own agent, and for that buyer's agent to deal with the seller's agent and have sort of two agents involved in the transaction. Is that becoming more the case here, and why would I want to do that?
Yes, you're right. So in the US, depending on which state, it's not the same in everywhere in the US, but very common for a buyer to engage a real estate agent to help them, in some cases with the search, but most often with the transaction part of buying a property. It's been far less common in the UK and Australia. So it took off, I guess, in London a couple of decades ago, and then Sydney has followed. And it's, I guess the general idea is, a bit like you only sort of buy property potentially a few times in your life. So you want to get those big decisions right. And the idea is to level the playing field by having a professional on your side of the transaction, because, of course, the real estate agent is working for the seller or the vendor. So, in Australia, most people work on a fixed fee for service as buyer's agents. Slightly different model in the US, where the commission tends to be split. But I think it's becoming more popular, particularly as people move or invest interstate. We've got different laws, rightly or wrongly. Real estate laws are different in every state and territory. So having a familiarity with the market and the laws that you're buying under tends to be a good thing. So yeah, it's increasing, but it's still only probably about 2 to 3% of transactions involved with buyers agents in Australia.
Right. And is that up from 0%? How long ago do you think it was 0%? 20 years ago? In the 2000s?
Well, unlike mortgage broker, there's very few statistics on this, and it's very difficult to actually get a handle on percentages because it's not formally recorded anywhere. If you look at the ABS or the RBA, there's no statistics on it. So best estimates are around 3%. And yeah, I guess if you went back to the Sydney Olympics, there would have been very few transactions going through with the buyer's agent back then. So yeah, broadly from nothing to about 3%. But yeah, it's a lot of finger in the air stuff, because you see a lot of buyer's agents operate under a full real estate license. So the figures just aren't well picked up anywhere.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that's an interesting trend to watch out for. So I imagine as a buyer's agent, you are dealing with selling agents and buyers and sellers sometimes directly every day of the week. Tell me what's happening on the ground now. Were you, for example, when interest rates were rising up until a few months ago, in the first half of this year, a lot of the property sort of commentariat online had their various views, but I think, dealing with transactions day to day might give you a slightly different insight. So were you able to sort of see this surprise second wave before a lot of the commentary in the media? And what are you seeing now, perhaps, that's coming along that isn't quite being talked about yet?
I think it probably depends on where you are in the country. So you and I are in
Ah,
southeast Queensland, where there is a real shortage of housing, and we've got still a very, very high net interstate migration, particularly to southeast Queensland. So yes, I mean, even this weekend just gone, we've had our buyers agents going to open homes, places like Toowong, 100 buyers going through. I mean,
wow.
it's almost like boom-like conditions, but I would say that's probably not the case everywhere in the country. If you went to Canberra or Darwin, you'd probably be seeing something different. And I'm fairly sure a lot of the regional markets that got overheated through that rush to the regions through the COVID period, well, yeah, they would be cooling too. So, I mean, generally speaking, at the macro level, there's a shortage of stock. So not many
Mm,
vendors have had the confidence to list. And I think quite a lot of homeowners are actually a bit wary of selling because they're worried about not finding somewhere to move to, paradoxically. So
right.
yeah, it's been a very unusual few years, and you can't really sort of look back at previous cycles and sort of make direct comparisons because we've had so many unprecedented changes in recent years with border closures and then the stimulus
Yeah.
package with JobKeeper and now the borders reopening and record immigration again. So yeah, I think if you'd gone back 15 months ago and said that the cash rate target would be above 4%, you'd have expected a lot more fallout than there has been. And I guess that's a
Yeah.
function of record population growth, a lot of builders struggling and going insolvent. And I think people are actually looking ahead potentially to the peak of the interest rate cycle and just worrying about the housing shortage. So, yeah, it's very unusual, but certainly in Brisbane and southeast Queensland, there's a lot of buying activity and almost a fear of missing out, which is quite unexpected.
Wow. And can you speculate? Do you talk to many sellers about their hesitation? So I guess one interesting pattern I've noticed in the data is that turnover of property, so the proportion of property that actually sells in a year, it used to be a lot higher until the early 2000s, and since the 2000s boom has dropped substantially. And you're suggesting that recently people are relatively cautious about selling. And is that because people already sold and relocated during COVID, and so that we're in this shadow of people brought forward decisions, and now there's not much trade happening, and we've got more buying and interest? Can you speculate on that, or do you know if you had any conversations recently?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you look at the multi-decade trend, and this is something that groups like REA and Domain have been very keen to understand because it's absolutely critical to their business. Well,
That's right.
I think if you went back sort of 7 or 8 years ago, the housing turnover declined because we had a huge boom in apartment construction. So a lot of buyers went towards new dwellings rather than the existing stock. But I think if you look sort of over a longer time frame, well, the average holding period has increased quite significantly, and I think that's partly a function of stamp duty and transaction costs. I think a lot of those stamp duty brackets were designed with lower property prices in mind, and if you're looking at upgrading to let's say a $2 or $3 million home in Sydney or Melbourne, there's a serious disincentive to be buying and selling too often there. So I think a lot of people are staying in situ because of that as well. And I think in recent times, yeah, it's just a confidence thing. There's very little quality stock on the market, at least in the capital cities, and that's disincentivizing people from selling because they're worried about actually finding somewhere to move to. I've actually got clients who are keen to buy or
Mm,
upgrade in places like Perth, but they just, they say, well, there's no stock on the market, so I'm not selling my place. And Yeah, so that's a dynamic that's certainly underway at the moment.
I've always found this interesting, the dilemma of buying and selling at the same time. There's some kind of art. So maybe some listeners don't know, but I used to work in real estate, tried my hand at selling houses and being a property manager and all that. And it was always a trick when a buyer needed to sell a place and a seller wanted to buy a place at the same time, and trying to triangulate those transactions, because no one had any money except what was in their house. And, sometimes financing was difficult. Do you think that's getting easier? Do you think it's getting easier in 2023 compared to when I was trying to sell houses in 2003 to sort of buy and sell without having to rent or, take 12 months or more to do it? And, are there bridging loans? I'm just curious if it's better or whether it's still difficult.
I think it's difficult at the moment because stock levels are low. But I think if you got stock back into a level of equilibrium, I would say that the Australian system is pretty good overall. It's never going to be easy. But if you compare to, well, let's say the UK, where I'm originally from, over there, you can end up with, they have a system where effectively the buyers and sellers get into a chain, and you might have multiple buyers and sellers in a chain system. And if one person pulls out, or if there's if a mortgage falls over or whatever the case may be, you can see the whole thing just blows up, and then you're back to square one. And it can take, as you said, it could take a year, that circumstance, for people to move. And it's such a serious disruption. For everybody in the process. The conveyancers and solicitors are taking months over a transaction. It's really, it's not great for labour force mobility. It's really difficult for people to get on with their lives. At least in Australia, let's say Queensland, you generally got 14 days to do your due diligence and 30 days to settle. So, that can bring its own challenges. And sometimes we find that vendors actually rent back the property that they've sold for a period of time until they can move on to the next place. But at least it gets done quickly. New South Wales, 42 days. So it's never going to be perfect, but certainly compared to the British system, it's a million miles apart.
Right. So most people who sell and buy to upgrade either buy a second home first and then happen to own two at the same time, and before they sell the first one, or they rent back the place they've sold, or they move and rent and shop around for 6 or 12 months and then buy again. There's no better alternative, really. It's very rare to be able to buy and sell and move directly into your place. Is that still the case?
It's pretty tricky, yes. And I would say at the moment it's very difficult because if a quality family appropriate property comes up for sale, there's likely to be multiple buyers interested in that property. So there's no certainty of getting that property bought, and therefore people are quite unwilling to list their own property until they've got some more clarity. So it's never going to be ideal, but I'd say the Aussie system overall is certainly much better than you'd see overseas. So I think the big real challenge is, I would say, stamp duty, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, because it's just it's becoming a disincentive for people to transact. So that will, it's been looked at, and it has been looked at for a long time with a potential switch to land tax, but it seems to be happening at a glacial pace, shall we say.
Yeah, I always think with stamp duty, Canberra's wound back its stamp duty significantly and increased land taxes, and I wonder how much different things are there really at the end of the day. Is it still hard to buy and sell and trade there? Is there still no quality stock? Do you buy and sell in Canberra?
I don't. I haven't been to Canberra for a little while, actually, for various reasons. So I'm not actually sure how the market dynamic is playing out there. I think it's softening. It's a fascinating housing market in its own right, because if anywhere in the country should have some land available to be built on it, you would think it would be the ACT, and yet we always seem to be talking about a shortage of housing. So, but I guess that's another topic which we'll no doubt come on to.
Well, let's. I've got a couple of things before I get on there, because you sent me a message about a regional renaissance in housing solutions. But before we get on to that, just flagging for the listeners, there's a lot of talk. So there's two more things I want to talk about: foreign buyers and snobbery. Okay. Foreign buyers, are they back? I'm seeing some data that they're back. Is that a new thing? What have you noticed? Is it a Sydney-centric thing? What's your impression on the ground?
Yes, I think yes, foreign buyers definitely increasing, and the surveys generally. So NAB, for example, would pick this up in their surveys, and it kind of makes sense. I think we've got record low vacancy rates. We've also seen the return of international students, which is another pathway for international funds. Now, yes, you'd be interested, actually. Some years ago, I got a phone call from the ATO who were talking about foreign investment in Australian real estate, and I almost had a heart attack because I was thinking, well, I've been somehow implicated in some kind of money laundering scheme. And in fact, I only that week done a piece in the Fin Review, which almost implied something similar. But anyway, it was actually just a discussion because the ATO at the time was doing, at the behest of the government, an investigation into the pathways of where foreign capital comes in. Now, I guess if you're not familiar, in Australia, unlike in, let's say, London, foreign buyers can generally only buy new property, and sometimes they can buy development sites if they're going to add to the housing stock. But certainly, if you went back a decade ago, there was a lot of, in particular, money from China finding its way into established real estate as well, which was the purpose of the investigation, I guess, to see where and how that was happening. So these surveys, there's always this question about, well, how much of this, how much of the funds are going into new housing, and how much is finding its way to established real estate, and are those buyers actually qualified? Well, the surveys are a bit vague on that. But of course, these days, capital is much more fluid, and well, there's 1 million Australians of Chinese descent or heritage now. So there's plenty of ways that money can find its way in. And it does seem, I guess, with the return of international students, that that's happening again. So, there's always that debate as to how much is sort of going into new housing and established, but it does seem to be on the increase, at least.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting one. I think in the 2010s boom, foreign buying was a huge part of the, apartment construction story in Sydney and Melbourne because, foreign buyers, had an easier time buying new and off the plan housing. And, in the process of all that demand, not only did they stimulate construction activity, but also prices. And there was a lot of debate. And I remember in Canada, I think they created a foreign buyer surcharge, like an extra stamp duty or an extra tax on foreign buying. And then they created a vacancy tax. So foreign owners with vacant residential property paid a premium. And I think, 3/4 of the revenue they raised from their vacancy tax were from foreign buyers. But it's interesting because I think, that had a big effect on the market. But then during COVID, we just reduced interest rates and sort of rescued those high prices. And then it became sort of an Aussie driven boom after that. So as much as we complain about it, we have this weird situation where if the economy turns bad, we bail out the housing market anyway. And so as much as you wanted to blame foreign buyers, we kind of liked those high prices anyway. And when prices were threatened to fall, we wanted to keep them up. So it's a really
good point you make, because there's a lot of talk at the moment about the undersupply of housing. And as you said, the previous construction boom, which was actually the biggest cyclical boom we've ever seen in Australia, was largely driven by investment from overseas, particularly from mainland China, because most Aussies don't like to buy new apartments. We know statistically that the loss on resale is higher if you buy a brand new apartment, because you tend to pay a price premium, effectively the developer's profit. And then when you come to sell, it's a second-hand property, no longer got that newness premium. But a lot of sort of capital flight from China fueled the previous construction boom. And then Australia, New South Wales introduced a stamp duty surcharge for non-residents. Victoria did the same. And that basically killed it off. And we've never reinvigorated the sort of foreign buying of new apartments, which, of course, there's always this debate about, is it the right quality of stock? But I guess the thing is, if you get a large supply of new housing, even if it's only largely suitable for renters, it does have a knock-on impact to the rest of the housing market. So you would think that you're right, speculative vacancies were an issue for non-resident buyers. But if you want to stimulate housing supply, why are we turning away foreign capital for new apartments? I'm surprised it hasn't had a look in again, but for the time being, it's just not happening.
Yeah, well, I think your point there is that quantity has a quality all of its own when it comes to these apartments. And, I think at the moment it wouldn't really make a huge difference because we're simply at the limits of the construction sector currently, right? So,
Yeah, fair point.
I know a bunch of property developers who have well pre-sold buildings, and they have just got them on hold because they just can't find a builder who they think can finish a building at the moment. So that's going to take a couple of years to wash out of the system. That disruption. Sorry, I'm going to go on a rant here for a couple of minutes, but that stimulus
Rant away.
had, it's my podcast. This is my chance, right? That stimulus we had during COVID, the renovators, what do they call it? The 2 construction grants we had. What were they called again, Pete? My mind's...
There was the home builder stimulus
That's
for
right.
new homes, and then there was also a renovation stimulus package as well.
That's right. And I do feel like the money that just got thrown at housing and the low interest rates during COVID are very unnecessary in retrospect and very disruptive, simply because of the size of the stimulatory effect, right? And the construction sector during a lockdown with global supply chain issues, with sourcing all your bits and pieces, was never going to be able to just pump out, triple the number of dwellings. So I think my rant here is going to finish. I hope in retrospect we learn from that and we don't just try next time there's a big global upheaval to overstimulate housing construction during that period, because I think it would have been better to hold back then, and we might have had a more stable construction market today. Would you think that's right, or do you have a different view, Pete?
Yes, I do agree. I think it's interesting. If you look back at the time, a few of the Labour MPs were saying this is going to be a fizzer, it's not going to work. But actually, we've seen time and time again, if you give people free money, they spend it. If you give people access to free, we've seen this in Western Australia before. There were grants for new housing construction and people snapped them up. So yes, and actually it's been a big part of the inflation story has been the cost of new dwellings. Now, I guess officially in the CPI figures, they were up over 20% year on year at the peak. But actually, if you look at the cost of delivering a medium density or higher density project, well, they're up 50% since pre-COVID. So it's a huge part of the inflation story at a time when, as you said, supply chains were stuffed, and New Zealand had similar issues, even without the same stimulus packages. So yeah, and I think, as you said, this probably goes back to your point on zoning, but there's plenty of projects that could be constructed, but at the moment there's no incentive to do so. A lot of developers are insolvent or on the borderline of insolvency, paradoxically, a lot of them, the more they build, the more money they're losing. So a lot of them are shutting up shop until the next cycle now.
That's right. I think people do underestimate that cycle, and I've talked to Catherine Cashmore on the show before about the cycles. So let's then talk about what are the issues in housing, and what are this regional renaissance, investment in infrastructure, tech, and schools. So people seem to have a real issue. There's some kind of crisis right now. I tweeted the other day that you can buy a 2-bedroom apartment, half an hour train ride from Sydney, for $370,000. And I do wonder if part of what we call the crisis is just housing snobbery. We all just want to live in the best places and we just don't want to live near poor people. And how much is real, and what could we do about it? You wanted to talk about the Mittelstand economies and this new wave. What are your thoughts, Pete? What should we be doing, and how should we be thinking about what people are calling the current housing crisis?
Well, look, there's a few different things here. Firstly, I think the property in question you mentioned was in Lakemba. A two-bed apartment. Look, Lakemba's, I used to love the lead bread you could buy down there. But I guess the issue there is, two-bedroom apartments for a young family or a growing family don't necessarily fit the bill. So there's definitely a question about the type of properties we're talking about. Because you're right, there are cheap apartments, particularly in Melbourne, actually. If you go to a place like Elwood or the Docklands or even around the CBD, there's plenty of cheap units. But what really people want often is a detached home with a picket fence, a backyard and a hills hoist and a barbecue. Well, look, I think we need to stop pretending that we can manage that sustainably in, Leichhardt or Newtown or Erskineville as the population grows. And look, immigration settings is another part of that story because there's simply too many people and not enough space. Now, it might be possible in, let's say, Camden Park South or something, but that's 65 clicks out of Sydney, and not everyone wants to be out there. But look, the pandemic has unexpectedly presented us with a golden opportunity for employees to show that they can work productively and flexibly, both from home, as you're doing right now, and so am I, and also close to home. So there's a real opportunity to be embraced here, to create a vision for dynamic regional living. So of course, the capital cities have got certain unique benefits, the frequency of interactions and the concentration of skills. You would probably say economies of scale as an economist. And, they talk about the potential for serendipitous events and all that kind of thing. But instead of trying to work out how we can cram 40 million people into Sydney, Melbourne and the southeast Queensland coastal strip, surely the aim should be to create a bigger and more enlightened vision for dynamic and thriving regional cities. Am I wrong?
That makes total sense to me. I think, for example, we always talk about high-speed rail from Sydney to Melbourne, right? Connect the three cities. And I'm like, wouldn't a regional rail network, if you have to come to the office 3 days a week, but you can get a high-speed rail from the Sunshine Coast or Gympie to Brisbane, wouldn't that make the regions attractive to a more diverse range of businesses and different households? So I'm totally with you that regionalization or somehow directing public funds to promoting these towns makes sense. I think as an economist, I'll put my economist hat back on, you just can't fight economies of scale sometimes, right? Like big regions attract people, which make them more attractive and so on. And if you look at any country, form like China, any country that's modernized and marketized, all you see are people flood from small towns to cities. And so fighting that economic force with public policy, is it enough to just build some trains, real fast, nice, convenient trains? Is that enough? Or do you need to also shift public services there, public government departments? I mean, Canberra's 100 years old and we shifted the whole federal government there. There's only 300,000 people. Oh, it's 450,000 now, right? But that's an 100-year project with the might of the federal government. And you can say, oh, okay, it kind of worked. Are we going to be able to do that, in Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland as well? That's my dilemma, that we're as much as I think improving regional transit is great, there's still those economic forces.
Yeah, look, I tend to agree up to a certain point. Now, and Australia is one of the most urbanised countries in the world, as we always hear. And look, the UK has similar challenges with the London southeast effect. But then we had this stupid debate about, do we build a high-speed rail that links up London to, Leeds and Birmingham? And instead of thinking, well, why can't we actually decentralise and invest in Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool, Northwest Hub? I've got a list in my head of maybe 24 regional cities that could benefit. Now, if your point is that we need to be, in some way linked to the capital cities, I mean, actually, Infrastructure Australia would agree with that to a certain extent, in which case, the focus should probably be on those peri-urban locations. So Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, and Newcastle and Wollongong, and then up our way to Toowoomba, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, because those areas are all within a 2-hour striking distance of the big capital cities. And you could probably throw in some parts of WA as well there. So, yeah, I mean, look, I probably would expand the list ideally to a bigger range of regional cities. But I mean, if you look at a place like Newcastle, place is booming. There's no reason why it can't be an extension of Greater Sydney in effect. So, yeah, I mean, there is always that challenge in that most new arrivals in particular go to Sydney and Melbourne. And I think, look, there is also this kind of rebuttable presumption that we actually want to fix the housing market and supply. I recently spoke at an event in Brisbane, and the subject was housing supply. But when I looked around the room, there was the housing minister, there was developers there, but also, property managers, real estate agents, buyers agents. And to be honest, most of them had a vested interest in the status quo. And maybe the market's working just fine for many, if not most people. So, but assuming you do want to bring about change, then surely a level of decentralization, particularly now that the pandemic has showed that more people can work from home, well, that could be something that's promoted. Now, I suppose you could say, now, why don't we live in somewhere like Toowoomba? I guess in my case, because I want to be near the beach. But, what do you need to do to make those cities, create a buzz or excitement? Well, you need really good employment and shopping hubs, high-speed internet and telephone connectivity. But, people like to see things, really great schools, healthcare, transport, as you mentioned, the sort of road, rail and airport stuff. But you generally need to create a vision and a sense that, hey, something's really happening here, making a place that people really want to be.
Yeah, look, I think we're on board, and I think this has been somewhat part of many plans for a long time. I know the Southeast Queensland Regional Plan is very much about all the hubs in the region and promoting them. One thing I noticed, though, is there's competition between these let me make 2 points. Firstly, we did regionalize automatically during COVID, and the result was all the regions got expensive. So the question is, how much of that is going to take pressure off infrastructure in the cities and make just infrastructure investment more efficient, and how much is going to change the cost of housing? I think they're independent questions. The other thing is about, and I'm going to bring it back to the snobbery question. I was out at Ipswich the other day, and I just thought, mate, this is so convenient to Brisbane. It's like a half-hour drive, train lines well connected, houses are dirt cheap. I almost felt like I should move there. But, there's a sort of cultural snobbery if that's where, poor people live. I don't want to be part of that working class culture. Do you think that is an issue as well, or do you think the economics overrides that over time and places gentrify and change?
I think they do gentrify. Yeah, to your point on the regional price boom, well, we do have, despite the home builder stimulus, we've got a relatively inelastic housing supply. I think that's become more so the case over the recent cycles, because we've got more apartment projects these days, and they can take 2 or 3 years to be constructed instead of, say, a year or less for detached housing. But actually, yes, in those thinner or more illiquid markets, it takes a relatively smaller change in the number of people moving in to see prices go sky high. And say I live at Noosa, and we saw a massive influx of people from particularly Victoria, but also New South Wales, and famously a lot of NIMBYism in the Sunshine Coast as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was no way that the housing supply could respond that quickly in the short run. But I guess, over time, you would think regional markets, there's a lot more land available for release. I think actually in a lot of the tree change markets, prices are steadily at least coming back down. So yeah, in theory, the housing supply should respond in time. I think you're right. There is a level of snobbery that's not unique to Australia, of course, but that can change over time as well. But I think generally when you do get sort of an uplift in supply, it has a sort of a effect at the macro level across the whole market. So generally a cheaper area will eventually fill up. We saw that with the oversupply of building in Brisbane 7 or 8 years ago. Is that generally when the rents fell, then people were happy to move in, and eventually the market finds a new level.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think over time, like, we got to understand that the supply comes in cycles. So there definitely are periods where, it dampens rental growth, but then the dampened rental growth slows the next wave of supply, and then we rinse and repeat that cycle the next time. Look, I don't think we're going to solve housing on this conversation, Pete, but I think you've definitely got me thinking about a lot more of the details. Maybe you can share with the listeners where they can find your writing. I know you've got a podcast, and what's the best way to keep up to date with your analysis of the property market?
I write a daily blog, Pete Wargent Blogspot, or you can find me on Twitter, or petewargent.com. Plenty of places to find me. I'm fairly active online. And there's always a healthy debate going on social media, so come and join the fun.
Yeah, that's great. And if you need a buyer's agent, maybe your first stop should be to talk to Pete as well. Buying a house, I like to say in property, everyone lives in a house, so they think they know about the market and they can understand sort of the macro level view of housing just because they live in a house or they've paid the rent. But, it does take years of experience to really have a good understanding of what's happening and what things affect the market. So look, Pete, I really appreciate your time. We should definitely do this again, and thanks for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks, Cal.